The Earl of Holloway opened the door himself. No butler, no servant. Only the man society whispered about in drawing rooms. The widowed nobleman whose wife had fallen from a tower 5 years earlier. Lightning tore across the sky behind him, illuminating the stone towers of Holloway Manor, like the teeth of some ancient beast. Elizabeth Harrington stood soaked to the bone on his doorstep, rain streaming down her hair, her gloved hands trembling. She had come to beg for work. Instead, she found the most dangerous man in England studying her as though he already knew why she had come. "Miss Harrington," he said quietly. It was not a question. Elizabeth froze. Few things frightened her now, not after the last 3 weeks. But hearing her name spoken in that low, controlled voice made her stomach tighten. "You recognize me, my lord," she managed. Nicholas Whitmore, Earl of Holloway, lifted the silver candelabrum slightly. The flickering light revealed a face far younger than the rumors suggested. 35, perhaps. Dark hair perfectly combed despite the late hour. Sharp aristocratic cheekbones. Eyes the color of cold steel. Eyes that seemed to see straight through her soaked dress, her exhaustion, her desperation. "I recognize your father's features," he replied calmly. A bolt of lightning cracked above the estate. "Sir James Harrington once lost 300 pounds in my drawing room." Elizabeth's throat tightened. 300 pounds had been only the beginning. "My father is dead," she said. The words felt heavier every time she spoke them. "He hanged himself 3 weeks ago." For the first time, something flickered in the Earl's eyes. Not surprise, recognition. "Yes," he said quietly. "I heard." He stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze to death on my doorstep." Elizabeth crossed the threshold. The great hall smelled faintly of wax and dust. Most of the furniture was draped in white sheets like silent ghosts. Holloway Manor had once been one of the most vibrant houses in the county. Now it felt like a mausoleum. The Earl led her into a small sitting room where a fire burned low in the hearth. "Drink," he said, pouring brandy without asking permission. Elizabeth accepted the glass. Her hands trembled as the heat spread through her chest. Nicholas sat opposite her, watching with quiet patience, like a man waiting for the truth to reveal itself. Finally, she forced herself to speak. "I came to ask for employment, my lord." "A position as a governess." One dark brow lifted. "I was seeking one some months ago," he said. "No one accepted." He leaned back slightly. "I suppose my reputation discourages applicants." Elizabeth lifted her chin. "I am not discouraged by rumors." "That makes you unusual." Silence stretched between them. Then he spoke again. "Tell me, Miss Harrington," he said slowly, "why does a young lady of good family arrive alone at midnight during a storm to ask a man like me for employment?" The question was gentle, but it cut straight to the bone. Elizabeth swallowed, because propriety had already been stripped from her life like wallpaper torn from a ruined house. "Our home was seized," she said. "After my father's death, we discovered he owed more than 20,000 pounds. She forced the rest out before pride could stop her. The servants were dismissed, everything sold." Nicholas listened without interruption. "And your siblings?" "Thomas is 14. Her voice tightened. "He is at Eton. But the headmaster has given him 3 days before his tuition expires." "And Rosalie?" 16, living with an aunt in Bath who has made it clear she will not support her." The words came faster now. "I have written to every acquaintance we ever had, cousins, friends of my father, gentlemen who once dined at our table." She laughed softly. None of them had answered. "Apparently," she said, "no one wishes to be associated with the family of a man who died in disgrace." Nicholas studied her for a long moment. "So," he said quietly, "you came to the mad Earl." There was no bitterness in his tone, only fact. "I came to the only place left," Elizabeth replied. "I need work." The Earl rose and walked slowly to the fireplace. For several moments he said nothing. Only the crackle of flames filled the room. When he finally spoke, his back was still turned. "A governess earns perhaps £5 a month," he said. "That will not keep a boy at Eton." Elizabeth's chest tightened. She had known that, but hearing it spoken aloud crushed the last fragile thread of hope. Then he added calmly, "There is another possibility." He turned, his gray eyes fixed on hers. "I require something more than a governess." Elizabeth's pulse began to race. "And what is that, my lord?" Nicholas Whitmore held her gaze. "I require a wife." The glass nearly slipped from her fingers. "I beg your pardon?" "My father's will contains an unfortunate clause," he said evenly. "If I do not produce an heir before my 40th birthday, the entire Holloway estate reverts to the crown." He paused. "I have 2.5 years left." Elizabeth stared at him. He continued as though discussing the purchase of a horse. "I propose a practical arrangement. Marry me." Her heart thundered. "In return, your brother remains at Eton with every expense paid. Your sister receives a London season and a dowry large enough to secure an excellent marriage. And you," he finished quietly, "become Countess of Holloway." Elizabeth searched his face for madness, for cruelty, for anything that suggested the rumors were true, but she found only something colder: loneliness. "Why me?" she whispered. "You could marry any lady in England." Nicholas laughed softly. What respectable father would give his daughter to the man whose wife leapt from a tower? Silence filled the room. "You," he said gently, "are the first woman of noble birth to cross this threshold in 5 years." Elizabeth's pulse pounded in her ears. "And if we never produce a child?" He considered that. "Then I lose everything. But your siblings will already be secure." Another flash of lightning illuminated the windows. Elizabeth realized something then. They were both desperate. She lifted her chin. "When would this marriage take place?" Nicholas answered without hesitation. "Tomorrow morning." Elizabeth's heart raced wildly. This was madness, absolute madness. But Thomas had 3 days before expulsion. Rosalie had no future at all. And somewhere beneath Nicholas Whitmore's cold composure she sensed something broken rather than dangerous. She inhaled slowly, then said the only words left to her: "I accept." The Earl studied her for a moment longer. Then he gave a faint, almost surprised smile. "Very well, Miss Harrington. Welcome to Holloway Manor." And to a marriage neither of them truly understood. Elizabeth Harrington became Countess of Holloway before the sun had fully risen. The wedding took place in the small stone chapel beside the estate. A quiet ceremony attended only by the village vicar and 2 witnesses who looked far more frightened of the groom than impressed by the title. The vicar's hands trembled as he opened the register. Elizabeth noticed it when she placed her gloved hand into Nicholas Whitmore's. The Earl's grip was steady, calm, almost detached. He spoke the vows clearly, his voice deep and measured, as though reciting the terms of a legal contract rather than pledging a lifetime to a woman he had met only hours earlier. Elizabeth wondered if he even realized what the words meant. When the ceremony ended, the vicar exhaled in visible relief. Just like that, the desperate daughter of a disgraced gentleman had become one of the most powerful women in the county. The transformation felt surreal. But Nicholas wasted no time honoring his promises. Before breakfast, he summoned the estate steward. Elizabeth watched from the breakfast table as 3 sealed letters were prepared. "One to Eton," Nicholas said calmly. "The headmaster will receive full payment for Thomas's education through university." Elizabeth felt her throat tighten. "And the second?" "To Bath." He folded the wax seal carefully. "For your sister's dowry and expenses for a London season." Elizabeth stared at him. "You move very quickly, my lord." Nicholas met her gaze evenly. "I gave my word." There was no pride in his voice, only certainty. The first week of marriage passed in an unusual calm. Elizabeth wandered the long corridors of Holloway Manor trying to understand the strange new life she had entered. Servants slowly returned to the estate. A dignified London butler named Hewsam arrived 2 days later. An Irish cook followed soon after. Nicholas explained the changes with quiet practicality. A countess requires a proper household. Elizabeth suspected the truth was simpler. The house had been too empty for too long. Despite the renewed activity, Nicholas himself remained distant. He appeared at meals precisely on time. He was always courteous, always respectful. The conversation rarely lasted long. After dinner, he disappeared for hours, sometimes into the library, sometimes out onto the estate. Sometimes Elizabeth heard footsteps climbing the tower staircase late at night. No explanation was offered, none requested. Yet the silence between them slowly began to feel less like indifference and more like restraint, as if both of them feared disturbing something fragile. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from Eton. Elizabeth opened it in the small sitting room overlooking the garden. The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas's. "Dearest Lizzie, the headmaster summoned me personally to his office today. He informed me that my entire education has been paid for through university. He also mentioned your new title. The Earl of Holloway, he said, is a man of honor." Elizabeth swallowed. The letter continued. "But Lizzie, what are people saying about him? Why does everyone fall silent when I mention his name? Did you truly marry him for our sake?" Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the letter. Before she could answer the questions herself, she heard music drifting faintly through the corridor. Soft, melancholic, a piano. Elizabeth followed the sound down the long eastern hallway of the manor. The notes grew clearer, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The music seemed to float through the silent house like a memory. She reached a white door at the end of the corridor. It stood slightly open. Elizabeth hesitated before gently pushing it wider. The room beyond was breathtaking. Pink and gold walls, fresh roses placed in crystal vases, dresses carefully arranged along a screen as if their owner might return at any moment. Jewelry rested neatly upon a vanity. Perfume bottles stood untouched. It was not a room, it was a shrine. Nicholas Whitmore sat at the piano, his back to her. His hands trembled slightly as they moved across the keys. "You may come in, Elizabeth." She froze. He had not turned. "I know you are there," he added quietly. Elizabeth stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of roses and lavender. "This was her room," Nicholas said calmly. "My first wife." His fingers continued playing the melody. Margaret loved this music. Elizabeth watched him carefully. There was no anger in his voice, no visible grief, only a strange stillness. "She played it every night before bed," he continued. She said it helped calm her mind. The final note faded. Nicholas's hands hovered above the keys. It did not calm them enough in the end. Elizabeth felt her heart tighten. He rose slowly and walked toward the window, rain tapping lightly against the glass. "Do you know what society says about that?" "Night?" he asked quietly. Elizabeth hesitated. "Yes. That I pushed her." The words fell into the room like stones. "That my jealousy drove her to madness until death seemed preferable to living with me." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "You should believe them." Elizabeth stepped closer. "I do not." Nicholas turned then. For the first time since she had met him, something wild flickered in his gray eyes. "Perhaps not with my hands," he said quietly. "But in every other way." His voice lowered. "I may have done exactly that." Silence filled the room. Elizabeth sensed that behind those calm words lay a wound far deeper than rumor. And for the first time since arriving at Holloway Manor, she realized the man she had married might be carrying a guilt powerful enough to destroy him. The silence in the white room stretched between them like fragile glass. Elizabeth did not speak immediately. She had learned something already about Nicholas Whitmore. He did not fear judgment as much as he feared pity. So she chose her words carefully. "What happened to her?" she asked softly. Nicholas looked back toward the piano. For a moment Elizabeth thought he might refuse to answer. Instead he walked slowly toward the instrument and rested one hand on its polished wood. "We tried to have a child," he said. The words were simple, but the tension in his shoulders revealed how heavy they truly were. "For 3 years." Elizabeth remained still. "Each month brought hope," Nicholas continued quietly. "And then disappointment." His fingers traced the piano keys without pressing them. Margaret began to blame herself. He gave a small, humorless smile. "I told her it did not matter." Elizabeth could hear the unspoken truth hanging in the air. "But it did," she said gently. Nicholas glanced at her. "Yes." His honesty came without defense. "It mattered to me more than I admitted." The candlelight flickered across his face, revealing exhaustion beneath the composed exterior. Then she finally conceived. Elizabeth's breath caught. Nicholas's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "For 7 months we believed our son would live." The word son lingered painfully in the air, but he was born lifeless. Elizabeth felt her chest tighten. Nicholas's jaw clenched. Margaret changed after that. He moved toward the window, staring out into the darkness. She stopped speaking. She refused food. She lay in bed for weeks staring at the ceiling as though the world had already left her behind. Elizabeth stepped closer. "And the physicians?" "I summoned every one of them." His voice hardened. "Doctors from London, specialists, priests." He shook his head. "They called it melancholy." His hands curled slowly into fists. But none of them knew how to bring her back. Elizabeth understood then. This was not the story of a cruel husband. This was the story of a man who had watched someone he loved disappear piece by piece. "On the night she died," Nicholas continued, "a storm much like the one you arrived in began over the estate." Elizabeth listened without moving. She asked me to sit with her. The words came slower now, to hold her while she cried. Nicholas's throat tightened. "And I told her I had estate matters to review." Elizabeth's heart sank. "I said I would return shortly." He let out a quiet breath. "But I did not return." "How long?" she asked gently. 2 hours. The candle flame trembled slightly. "When I came back." He stopped. Elizabeth did not need the rest. "The tower window was open," he finished quietly. The rain had already begun to flood the floor. From his pocket he removed a small folded piece of paper, old, yellowed. Elizabeth accepted it carefully. The handwriting was delicate and trembling. "Forgive me, Nicholas. I failed you as a wife. I failed you as a mother. You deserve a life without this burden." Elizabeth lowered the letter slowly. "She believed she was freeing you," Elizabeth said. Nicholas laughed bitterly. "She believed she was my prison." He turned away sharply. And perhaps she was right. Elizabeth stepped closer. "No." Nicholas looked at her again, surprise flashing briefly across his face. "She was ill," Elizabeth said firmly. "The loss of a child can destroy a mother's mind." "They told me that," he replied quietly. "They said nothing I could have done would have saved her." His voice lowered, but knowing that does not close the hole here. He pressed his fist against his chest. Elizabeth understood that pain far too well. "My father hanged himself," she said softly. Nicholas stilled. "Afterward, people whispered that our family must be cursed, that we must have done something terrible to make him abandon us." Her voice grew steadier. "For weeks I believed them." Nicholas watched her carefully now. "But eventually I realized something." "What?" "That his choice was not about us." She stepped closer until they stood only a few feet apart. "It was about a pain he could not carry any longer." Nicholas's eyes darkened. "People prefer villains," she continued. "They prefer simple stories. A cruel husband. A mad Earl. It is easier than accepting that grief can destroy even the strongest people." The words hung in the quiet room. Nicholas studied her face as though trying to understand something unfamiliar. "You are remarkably certain of this," he said. Elizabeth reached forward slowly and touched his arm. "I am certain of one thing." "And that is?" "You are not the monster they describe." Nicholas's breath caught slightly. The contact seemed to surprise him. "I see a man who tried to save someone he loved." Her voice softened. "And who has been punishing himself for failing ever since." For a long moment neither of them moved. Then Nicholas spoke quietly. "Why are you not afraid of me?" Elizabeth held his gaze. "Because I see you." Something shifted behind his eyes then. Not healing. Not yet. But perhaps the first fragile crack in the wall he had built around himself. And neither of them realized how dangerous that moment was becoming. Because compassion, once planted between two lonely hearts, had a way of growing into something neither of them had expected. Elizabeth's journey to Bath was meant to last 3 days. Yet from the moment her carriage rolled away from Holloway Manor, an unexpected unease settled in her chest. Not relief, not freedom, something else. The road curved through autumn countryside, fields washed gold beneath a pale sky. Mary, the young widow Nicholas had hired as her companion, sat opposite her quietly sewing. But Elizabeth's thoughts remained at Holloway. More precisely, with Nicholas. The last image she carried of him lingered painfully in her mind. Standing in the library window, his posture rigid, his voice controlled. "Perhaps it would be better if you did not return." She had recognized the lie the moment he said it. He had not been dismissing her. He had been protecting himself. Bath welcomed her with elegance and scrutiny. Her aunt's Georgian townhouse stood on one of the most fashionable crescents, its tall windows gleaming with polished glass. Aunt Prudence opened the door herself before the footman could announce her. "Elizabeth!" Her aunt's eyes scanned her from head to toe with frantic urgency. Thank heaven. Rosalie appeared seconds later, running down the staircase and throwing her arms around her sister. "Lizzie!" Elizabeth laughed softly, holding her close. "I promise you I'm not imprisoned in some Gothic dungeon." Rosalie stepped back anxiously. "But the rumors—" "Rumors," Elizabeth interrupted gently. Aunt Prudence lowered her voice. "They say the Earl was questioned by magistrates after his wife died. That the tower was locked from the inside. That servants heard arguments." Elizabeth felt irritation flicker in her chest. "And what do they say about my father now?" she asked calmly. The question silenced them both. Rosalie looked away. "That he ruined his family," she murmured. Elizabeth nodded once. "Exactly." She removed her gloves slowly. "Society adores tragedy when it belongs to someone else." Over the next 3 days, Elizabeth explained what she could. Not everything. Nicholas's deepest confessions were not hers to reveal, but enough to quiet their fears. She told them about the arrangement, about Thomas's tuition, about the servants returning to the estate, about Nicholas's quiet courtesy. "He has never raised his voice to me," she said during tea on the third afternoon. "Never touched me without asking." Rosalie watched her carefully. "You defend him rather passionately." Elizabeth paused. "I defend the truth." Her sister tilted her head curiously. "Do you like him?" The question caught her unexpectedly. Elizabeth opened her mouth to deny it, then stopped. Images surfaced in her mind without permission. Nicholas at the piano, Nicholas reading botany books in the quiet library, Nicholas standing silently in the doorway when she left for Bath, trying not to show how afraid he was she would not return. "I respect him," she said slowly, "and I think he's far lonelier than anyone realizes." Rosalie studied her expression. "That is not what I asked." Elizabeth did not answer, because the truth had begun to frighten her. On her final morning in Bath, Elizabeth took a walk alone beyond the crowded streets. The air smelled of damp earth and early autumn leaves. It was there she noticed the small plant nursery. Rows of young seedlings sat beneath a wooden canopy, their leaves glistening with morning dew. Elizabeth slowed. A memory surfaced immediately. Nicholas sitting in the library, studying a large illustrated book about roses, his fingers tracing the delicate drawings as though memorizing them. She had seen him reading it several times, always quietly, always with the same thoughtful concentration. The nursery owner approached her politely. "Looking for something special, my lady?" Elizabeth glanced at the rows of rose seedlings. Hope, fragile and green. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Roses." The gardener nodded approvingly and guided her through the selection. There were dozens of varieties: soft yellows, warm coral, blush pink. Elizabeth examined each one carefully. "Strong roots," she said finally. "And different colors." "Ah," the gardener smiled. "A new garden?" Elizabeth hesitated, then answered quietly, "Yes, a new beginning." The carriage reached Holloway Manor just as the evening sky burned orange behind the towers. Elizabeth stepped down before the footman could assist her. Bundles of carefully wrapped rose seedlings rested in her arms. The manor looked different somehow. Several windows glowed with candlelight. Smoke rose from the chimneys. The house no longer seemed abandoned. Hughes greeted her at the door. "Welcome home, my lady." Elizabeth felt warmth spread through her chest at the word. "Home. Where is the Earl?" she asked. "In the library." She walked quickly through the familiar corridors. Her heart beat faster with every step. When she entered the library, Nicholas sat hunched over a table covered with open books. A glass of untouched brandy stood beside him. He looked as though he had not slept. The moment he saw her, he stood so abruptly his chair nearly fell. "You came back?" The words escaped him before he could stop them. Elizabeth smiled softly. "I said I would." Nicholas ran a hand through his hair, clearly trying to regain composure. "I thought perhaps Bath might persuade you otherwise." Bath tried. He looked at her carefully. "And yet?" Elizabeth placed the wrapped seedlings on a nearby chair. "Yet I'd already decided." Nicholas's voice dropped. "Decided what?" She lifted one of the bundles and held it out to him. "I noticed you spend hours reading about roses." Nicholas looked down at the package in confusion. "So I thought perhaps," she continued gently, "it was time Holloway Manor had some again." He unwrapped the paper slowly. Inside rested a young rose plant, its green leaves trembling slightly. Nicholas stared at it as though it were something miraculous. "You brought roses?" Elizabeth nodded. "For the garden?" "For a new beginning." Nicholas's hands trembled slightly around the delicate stem. Then he gave a quiet, disbelieving laugh. "I prepared the garden." Elizabeth blinked. "You what?" Nicholas gestured toward the back doors. "Come with me." He led her outside into the fading light. Elizabeth stopped the moment she saw the grounds. The once dead garden had been completely transformed. The soil turned, beds arranged in perfect rows, tools scattered across freshly worked earth. 12 empty spaces waited patiently in the center. "You did this," she whispered. Nicholas suddenly looked almost embarrassed. "I thought, if you returned—" His voice faltered. Elizabeth stepped closer. "If I returned?" Nicholas looked at the prepared garden. "I wanted this place to feel like a home." Then he looked at her. Not just a bargain. And in that quiet garden, standing between the ghosts of the past and the fragile promise of roses, Elizabeth realized something dangerous had begun growing between them. The first rose was planted just before sunset. Elizabeth knelt in the soft earth beside Nicholas, her gloves discarded, dark strands of hair escaping the careful arrangement Mary had made that morning. Nicholas held the small seedling as though it were something far more fragile than a plant. "Too deep and the roots suffocate," he said quietly. "Too shallow and the wind will tear it away." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "That sounds suspiciously like advice about marriage." Nicholas paused. For a moment she wondered if she had gone too far. Then to her surprise the corner of his mouth lifted. "Perhaps it is." He carefully lowered the rose into the prepared soil. Elizabeth covered the roots with gentle hands, pressing the earth around them just as he had shown her. "Firm," he murmured, "but not cruel." She brushed dirt from her fingers. You speak about roses as though they are people. Nicholas looked at the small plant thoughtfully. Perhaps they are. The garden slowly transformed over the following weeks. Each afternoon, Elizabeth and Nicholas worked side by side. 12 rose bushes were planted in careful rows. Yellow, coral, soft peach, colors Holloway Manor had not seen in years. At first they spoke little while they worked. But silence between them had begun to change. It was no longer cautious. It was companionable. Elizabeth learned small things about him. Nicholas disliked idle gossip but loved poetry. He read botany books not merely for roses but for the quiet order they brought to his thoughts. And he had a dry sense of humor that surfaced unexpectedly when Elizabeth least expected it. The servants noticed the change too. Mrs. Brennan began humming in the kitchen again. Hughes polished the silver with quiet satisfaction. Even the once shadowed corridors of Holloway Manor seemed warmer. Yet one place remained untouched, the white room in the tower. Nicholas still visited it occasionally at night. Elizabeth heard the distant creak of the stairs and the soft closing of the door, but the visits grew shorter, and sometimes they did not happen at all. 6 weeks after Elizabeth's return, everything changed. A loud sound woke her just after midnight, a door slamming somewhere above. Elizabeth wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the corridor. The sound had come from the tower. Her heart quickened. She climbed the narrow staircase carefully. The door to the white room stood open. Nicholas stood inside holding a candle. He was looking around the room slowly as though seeing it for the first time. "Elizabeth," he said without surprise. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "I need to do this." She stepped inside cautiously. "What do you mean?" Nicholas looked at the dresses still hanging carefully beside the vanity. "I need to let her go." The words seemed to cost him something. "I cannot continue living as though she will return." Elizabeth felt a lump rise in her throat. "You are certain?" Nicholas nodded once. "I want to live again." He gestured quietly around the room. "All of this, it kept me frozen." Elizabeth stepped beside him. "You do not have to do it alone." Nicholas looked at her. "Will you stay?" "Of course." Together they began. Nicholas folded each of Margaret's dresses carefully, placing them inside cedar chests. Elizabeth wrapped the jewelry in delicate perfume bottles. They worked slowly, reverently, not erasing the past, but finally giving it peace. When they reached the piano, Nicholas hesitated. The sheet music for Moonlight Sonata still rested on the stand. Margaret's handwriting marked the margins. "She wrote in her note that she hoped I would find someone else," he said softly. Elizabeth watched him carefully. "I thought it was cruelty." He closed the music book gently. "But perhaps it was love." He placed it inside the chest. When the room was finally empty, Nicholas stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he closed the door. "Goodbye, Margaret," he whispered. Elizabeth reached for his hand. He did not pull away. And in that quiet moment, with the past finally laid to rest, Nicholas Whitmore allowed himself to hold her hand as though it belonged there. Yet neither of them spoke the truth growing between them, because some confessions were still too dangerous to say aloud. Spring arrived quietly at Holloway Manor. The rose garden bloomed all at once. Soft yellows opened beside warm coral blossoms, and the pale peach flowers Elizabeth had chosen now covered the beds Nicholas had prepared with his own hands. The once abandoned grounds had become the heart of the estate, and the house itself had changed. Laughter could sometimes be heard from the kitchen. Music drifted from the drawing room in the evenings. Nicholas no longer disappeared into long hours of silence, yet something unspoken remained between them, a delicate tension neither dared disturb. The moment of truth arrived unexpectedly. Thomas and Rosalie were visiting for dinner. Thomas had grown taller since Elizabeth last saw him, his Eton uniform fitting him with new confidence. Rosalie looked radiant, already beginning to attract attention from respectable families in Bath. The dining room glowed with candlelight. Mrs. Brennan had prepared far more food than 4 people could possibly eat. Conversation flowed easily, until Nicholas suddenly stood. Elizabeth looked up in surprise. His expression was unusually serious. "There is something I must say," he announced quietly. Thomas and Rosalie fell silent. Nicholas turned toward Elizabeth. "When we married," he began slowly, "it was a business arrangement." Elizabeth's heart began to race. "You required security for your siblings, and I required a wife to preserve my inheritance." He paused. There was no affection between us, only necessity. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Elizabeth remained perfectly still, but Nicholas took a step closer. "And yet," he continued, his voice tightening slightly, "something changed." His gray eyes met hers. "Between the storm the night you arrived and today, Elizabeth felt heat rise in her chest. Nicholas knelt beside her chair. Rosalie gasped softly. "You became more than my wife in name," he said quietly. "You became my companion, my ally, the reason this house feels alive again." His voice trembled slightly now. "You showed me that I was not the monster I believed myself to be." Elizabeth felt tears begin to blur her vision. Nicholas took her hand carefully, and somewhere during those quiet mornings in the garden, and those evenings in the library, he inhaled slowly. "I fell in love with you." The words hung in the air. Thomas stared at the table. Rosalie wiped her eyes. Nicholas continued quickly, almost nervously. "I do not expect you to feel the same. Our agreement never required love. But you deserve to know the truth." His voice softened. "You are no longer an obligation to me. You are the woman who saved my life." Elizabeth looked down at him, this proud, feared Earl, kneeling beside her like a man awaiting judgment. "Idiot," she said softly. Nicholas blinked in confusion. "A complete idiot." Rosalie nearly choked, trying not to laugh. Elizabeth stood and lifted Nicholas gently to his feet. "Do you truly believe I spent months planting roses with you out of simple politeness?" She held his face between her hands. "Do you think I defended your name in Bath because I pitied you?" Nicholas looked utterly bewildered. Elizabeth smiled through tears. "Nicholas Whitmore, I fell in love with you the moment I saw you preparing 12 beds in the garden for roses that did not yet exist." His breath caught. "I fell in love with you when you offered me freedom, even though it terrified you. And when you played the piano with tears in your eyes." Her voice softened. "I fell in love with the broken man brave enough to heal. Nicholas, I love you." For a moment he simply stared at her, as though he could not quite believe what he had heard. Then he pulled her into his arms. The embrace was fierce, almost desperate. "I do not deserve you," he whispered against her hair. Elizabeth laughed softly through tears. "Probably not. But you have me anyway." Nicholas pulled back slightly. His voice dropped. "May I kiss you?" Elizabeth smiled. "I wondered how long it would take you to ask." And when he finally kissed her, it felt less like a beginning, and more like two wounded hearts finally recognizing the home they had already found in each other. The kiss changed everything, not because it was dramatic, not because it was reckless, but because it was the first thing Nicholas Whitmore had done in 5 years that was not shaped by grief. Elizabeth felt it immediately, the hesitation in him, the careful restraint he had always shown, but beneath it there was warmth now, something alive. And when they finally pulled apart, the dining room remained silent. Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly. Rosalie was openly wiping tears. "Well," she murmured, attempting composure, "I believe that settles the matter." Nicholas laughed softly for the first time that evening, a real laugh. Not the dry, careful sound Elizabeth had heard before. This one carried relief. Life at Holloway Manor changed quietly after that night. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic declaration to society, but the house itself seemed to understand. Nicholas began taking breakfast with Elizabeth in the garden. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they simply sat together among the roses. The servants noticed the difference immediately. Hughes later remarked to Mrs. Brennan that the Earl had begun smiling, which, in his opinion, was a miracle worthy of church bells. Elizabeth noticed other changes. Nicholas slept more peacefully, the shadows beneath his eyes slowly faded, and he no longer climbed the tower stairs at night. The white room remained closed, not forgotten, but finally at peace. 3 months later the garden reached full bloom. 20 rose bushes now filled the beds. Nicholas had added several himself, deep crimson roses this time. For courage, he had explained when Elizabeth teased him. One warm afternoon Elizabeth found him standing in the garden watching the flowers sway in the breeze. "You planted these when I was gone?" she asked. Nicholas nodded. "I was thinking. That is usually dangerous." He smiled faintly. "I was thinking about the future." Elizabeth felt her heart flutter slightly. "And?" Nicholas reached for her hand. "For the first time in many years, I want one." His gaze softened. "With you." Elizabeth squeezed his hand. "I rather hoped you might say that." 2 years later, spring returned to Holloway Manor, and with it came the sound of a crying infant. Elizabeth stood beside the cradle in their bedroom, gently lifting the tiny bundle into her arms. "James Nicholas Whitmore," she murmured softly. "You seem determined to wake the entire house." The door opened quietly behind her. Nicholas entered, his hair slightly disheveled, his expression softened by exhaustion and joy. "Allow me," he said, carefully taking their son. At first fatherhood had terrified him. The fragility of new life had reopened old fears. But over the past 2 months, Nicholas had learned to hold the child with quiet confidence. James stopped crying almost instantly in his father's arms. Elizabeth smiled. He already prefers you. Nicholas kissed the child's forehead. The feeling is mutual. Then he looked at Elizabeth. Do you know what day it is? She tilted her head. Thursday. The anniversary. Elizabeth smiled slowly. 3 years since I arrived here in the middle of a storm. Nicholas stepped closer. The night I married the bravest woman in England. Elizabeth laughed softly. And I married the most misunderstood man in England. From the window they could see the rose garden below, now overflowing with color. Yellow, peach, coral, deep red, 28 bushes in total, each one planted during some moment of their life together. Thomas was finishing his studies. Rosalie had recently become engaged to a Viscount's son in Bath. The Harrington family had risen again, and Holloway Manor, once silent and haunted, had become a home filled with laughter. Nicholas slipped an arm around Elizabeth's waist. Do you regret it? He asked quietly. The storm, the proposal, all of it. Elizabeth looked at him, the man society once called mad, the man who had learned to forgive himself, the man who had planted roses in a dead garden simply because he hoped she might return. No, she said softly. Not for a single moment. James stirred sleepily in Nicholas's arms. Nicholas smiled down at his son. You know, he said thoughtfully, we may need more roses. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. Oh? One for James. And perhaps, he added gently, for brothers or sisters yet to come. Elizabeth laughed, resting her head against his shoulder. Outside, the garden shimmered with spring sunlight. The house that had once been ruled by grief now lived with something far stronger, hope, and Nicholas Whitmore, the Earl once feared and whispered about across England, had finally discovered the truth he spent years believing impossible. A broken heart could heal, not by forgetting the past, but by allowing love to grow again.